We live in a world where nutrition and diets are just as controversial as things like religion and vaccines. People get super angry if you tell them that something other than what they believe could work better for them. They get very uptight. Very. There's wars going on out there, especially on like Instagram against like carnivore and vegans. And it's terrible. It's very heated out there at the moment. Years ago, like the rest of the world, I jumped on the keto fasting carnivore bandwagon and thought this was it. The diet of all diets to help us lose weight easily. It was sustainable and it really seemed to work. Everyone that came, or almost everyone that came through my door, was put on a ketogenic fasting type diet. And the results were amazing. People were losing weight. They were able to stick with it for the most part. They were having all these amazing benefits. But then something started to happen. And it took a while for me to start to see this in my clinical practice. But I noticed this pattern. Women were starting to lose their hair, have chronic insomnia, heart palpitations for some of them. If they were cycling women, their menstrual cycles would sometimes disappear for a very long time. Thyroid issues where they suddenly were really fatigued. They would get their thyroid tested and realize that, their reverse T3 went high, their free T3 went low. They had low energy. And oddly enough, even some developed low-grade insulin resistance and high cholesterol. It wasn't happening to everyone, but it was happening to the majority of people that I was working with. And each person, it seemed to happen at different times. Some it was 3 months, others it was, a year, 2 years even. Well, the same thing, very similar thing happened to my guest today. He, like everyone else, jumped on the bandwagon and was working out, eating the low carb, cold plunging, fasting, and suddenly things took a turn for the worse. And instead of turning a blind eye, unlike most people, he began to dig into the research to find out what was really going on here. Dr. Jay Feldman is a health coach, independent health researcher, and the host of the Energy Balance podcast. He has degrees in neuroscience and exercise physiology from the University of Miami and decided to forego medical school after realizing that the conventional medical approach was not the solution to the health problems that so many of us face. After working through various conventional and alternative health paradigms and trialing countless diets, including everything from vegetarian to keto, Jay came across the idea that cellular energy is the foundation of our health. He now uses bioenergetic approach to help men and women around the world maximize their cellular energy and achieve freedom from low energy symptoms like chronic hunger, cravings, fatigue, brain fog, poor sleep, gut issues, and stubborn weight gain. You can find Jay at jayfeldmanwellness.com. So welcome, Jay, to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Karen. And I do have to say also, I'm not actually a doctor. I did forego medical school. So there's a
I
different
said
Dr.
Dr.
Jay
Jay.
Feldman.
Okay.
So yeah, not
I
to
had
get confused.
assumed. Okay, yes, good. Let's clarify that. Hey, so people would be like, he's not a doctor. I recently was actually looking at some way of getting a doctorate just to be taken that much more serious. And I was like going to pay out all this money and go back to school. And then my friend said to me, but why? She's like, do you really think that people aren't taking you seriously? And I'm like, wait a second, people are taking me seriously. And when you really break it down, it's exactly what you said. It's like going to medical school. What does that give you? Oh my gosh, nothing for what we're doing in this field, right? It doesn't give us this information that we have.
No, definitely not. And obviously there's always the group of people who need to see the letters after your name. But I think that doesn't mean that somebody knows more about nutrition or physiology or anything like that, and are actually able to do a better job of actually detecting when someone's able to really help them, or describe things from in terms of what's actually going on, as opposed to what maybe was taught in the many years of medical school.
Yes, exactly. So Jay, I first heard you on Ben Greenfield's podcast and I loved it. Like loved it the whole way that I was driving one whole way into town. I'm listening to it, just going, oh, this is just turning Ben upside down right now because Ben's this like ultimate biohacker and he has this like crazy regime in the morning of like cold plunging and his intense exercise regime and eating. And he's just got all these hacks that he's constantly doing. And you kind of came in and said, could this be causing more harm than benefit? And so let's just start with your story, because I think that that's such an important piece to what you're talking about, because you yourself experienced this.
Yeah, that's where I came from. And burning the candle at both ends with the intention of being healthy. That's what we were told, right? The cyclical ketogenic diets, the fasting, the depriving yourself of what your body was craving, the intense workouts, the supplements that are meant to do these same things, whether it's resveratrol or on from there. And that was I was following that crowd, very much paleo, low carb at that time. And I felt decent at first, like I felt good, and it seemed to help with some issues, but over time it did come at a cost. And it took a little while to realize it, but I was in a position, because I wasn't feeling as good as I was supposed to. The workouts were getting tougher. I wasn't recovering as well. My focus wasn't there as much in my classes at the time. Uh, Libido wasn't where it could have been. I was dealing with some chronic infections and issues like that, and all of the things that should have been improving, considering how committed I was and how intensely I was doing the things that I was supposed to be doing. And so I was ready. I was very open to a perspective to suggest that this was maybe not the right approach, and came across some information suggesting exactly that this entire idea that we need to be fighting against what our bodies naturally want, that we need to be depriving ourselves of energy and driving the stress so that we can adapt and become stronger, was actually not necessarily the right way to look at it, or an accurate way, full picture of what's going on. And that allowed me to start to shift my views and realize that the things that actually increase the provision of energy all the way down at that cellular level is what leads to health. And that means that if we're depriving ourselves of the carbohydrates, or if we're really restricting our eating window, or if we're trying to burn as many calories as we can at the gym, those things are actually going to deplete us, not just of our energy to work out, but of our energy to function well, for our digestive system to function well, for our reproductive system to function well, for our brains to function well. And so it was no surprise after that point that I was feeling the way that I was, and that led to a pretty major shift in the way that I began to look at things, and led to a whole shift, a pivot in terms of my research and the way I worked with people. As you were saying, I used to be a very big low carb advocate as well, and yeah, it kind of changed everything for me, and then of course for the people who I work with as well.
Yeah. So how into it were you? Like how long were you doing these things? What exactly like, were you doing the cold plunging and fasting for days on end, or, things like that?
As far as fasting goes, I never went beyond the intermittent fasting. I never did the full multiple day fasts. And I hadn't gotten into the cold plunging. I would do some sauna, but it was mostly very much low carb and fasting were the biggest things. I'm sure there were some others too that maybe don't come to mind right now, but it was for several years.
Oh, it was. Okay. Yeah, that's what
Yeah.
I wanted to know. Okay. So for several years. And did you see a health benefit to begin with? Like did you get into that whole, oh, I've got boundless energy and I'm getting shredded? And we see a lot of guys, testosterone actually go up in the beginning, and it actually shown in research to go up in the beginning when they start fasting. And so was that happening to you in the beginning? Were you getting the benefits?
I mean, I was definitely lean or shredded, as you said. Like that was definitely a part of it. It wasn't. I think it definitely led to more consistent energy originally, but I also wasn't coming from a place where I was really struggling in any manner. So it wasn't as much of a situation where I was really feeling bad and then went to feeling great. It was more maybe from feeling good or okay to feeling better. It wasn't such a dramatic shift for me at the time, but there were certainly some positive changes initially.
Yeah. And then you just started to, and then it started to go down.
Yeah, it started to go down. The cravings and hunger and restriction really started to catch up with me. It was getting tougher and tougher to continue with eating the way that I was. I was always watching the clock until the fast was up so I could have that first meal. And then even once I did, I was just waiting until I could have the next one. And that
Ah,
was a big part of it as well.
yeah, yeah, and I see that happening for women as well. I primarily work with women, so I'm going to mostly base all of this on what I saw happening to the females that were doing this and are still doing it. And I still, to this day, this is years later, I'm still every day that I'm working, I have somebody reach out to me, if not multiple people, to say that some version of that story of I did, I've been keto for 2 years. I lost 60 pounds in the beginning, and then suddenly it stopped. And suddenly I started to gain weight. Now, in the last year, I've put on 20 pounds and I haven't changed anything. And most people, what they'll do is they'll just continue to do it harder. They'll say,
Mhm.
okay, well, if this worked in the beginning, I have to just fast for longer. And I've been hearing, and I've talked about this several times now on my podcast, but some really big health professionals in our industry saying now to women things like the advice of, well, if you're really wanting to lose weight, you need to fast at least four, and I mean completely not eat for at least 4 days out of seven.
Oh my God. Yeah. Yeah. Just double down. As you were saying, I see that too, right? If low carb wasn't enough, then it's carnivore. And if
Yeah,
intermittent fasting wasn't enough, then it's multi.
yeah, or the one meal a day, that was
Hmm.
really big, and
Hmm.
really had great success when it came to the weight loss. Like women were, so many women, they'll still tell you this day, like one meal a day, and I just all the weight dropped. And I'm like, okay, well, you just wait, wait and see what's going to happen here. And some people, I'm not saying that it happens to everybody. There's just, it seems like there's a large percentage of people that this starts to happen for. I think men, it takes longer than women because we are meant to procreate and to carry children, right? So the hormones that we're having to produce, if you're signaling to the system that there's stress, which we're going to talk about, or around, your body's first thing is going to be, let's down regulate those hormones because God forbid you get pregnant. So let's just talk about the idea of hormesis or healthy stressors, because this is where it kind of all stems from. We've got people like, oh my God, well, there's countless people that are saying we should be in autophagy, that it's beneficial for us to put stress on our body, that we will live longer if we have calorie restriction. So explain first where does this come from, and why is it basically, it's not founded, I don't know, on actual research, or not, it's founded on some research, but that there's conflicting things about it.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of research there, but that doesn't mean that it's actually suggesting what we think it is or what we're told it is. So it's got an interesting history, hormesis does, where it started out as this idea that exposure to very potent toxins, things like mercury or cadmium, would be beneficial through this means. They cause a small amount of damage, and it causes our bodies to adapt and become stronger. And that's the general idea when we're talking about hormesis. It's this idea that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Small amounts of stress are beneficial because we adapt and become, we have these defensive adaptations. Autophagy is one of them that you mentioned. There's also the mitochondrial biogenesis and on from there. And so these things are supposed to be beneficial, and they happen when we're exposed to stress. And the idea is that if we hit this right range of stress, where it's not too much, but it's not too little, that's where we get all these benefits. And that's really the path to better health. And a lot of this, when you look through the history, actually has gone through or has gained popularity as a means for industry to defend their pollution of the environment and the small amounts of very toxic things that we're exposed to in our food supply and whatnot, where they're able to point to this research that suggests, hey, very small amounts of these things are actually beneficial to us. And when you look at that research, there's a handful of problems with it. Just that, they might look at some benefit in one certain area. Maybe there's a reduction in a certain type of cancer in one spot. But when they then kind of zoom out and look at the rest of the body, there's increased incidences of cancer elsewhere. So there's this kind of nefarious starting point as far as the kind of modern view of hormesis. And it's expanded since then, right? So now people aren't talking about these really potent toxins. They're saying anything that'll just cause a bit of stress, whether it's exercise or fasting or the cold plunges, those are going to be beneficial by the same means. They cause a bit of stress, and then that causes us to respond and become stronger and live longer and on and on. And as you were saying, there is a lot of research here, and a lot of it is based around the calorie restriction research, which is generally touted as the most well researched subject, or the most well agreed upon intervention for extending lifespan and improving health. And we're told everywhere that calorie restriction is the benefit, or is the main way to achieve benefits. Some people who used to be major advocates for fasting are now just saying that the fasting isn't even that beneficial. It's just because it allows you to restrict calories easier. But anyway, like, this is really where a lot of that the research centers on, and a lot of the evidence centers on. But it has quite a few holes in it. And I don't know how far you want to dig into those, but there's quite a few holes.
I do want to dig into it, because I know that I've looked at that paper several times, and kind of the breakdown of it all. And it was, okay, calorie restriction can improve longevity, but it also showed that the mice, because it's only been done on mice, lived longer, were also had a higher BMI, because they were eating more carbohydrates than the calorie. So it wasn't about calorie restriction. It was more about the macro breakdown, that they were saying, like, a higher carb diet with lower protein were the mice that ended up living longer. Is that correct? Did you hear that too?
So there's definitely a piece of like, the macronutrients are certainly a piece here. And part of it is protein, as you mentioned. So one of the biggest, essentially what it comes down to here, the major problem with this calorie restriction research is that there are a lot of confounding variables. One of them is macronutrients. There's some other ways that the studies are designed, whether it's in rodents, or sometimes they use lower organisms as well. And so one of the biggest confounding factors when it comes to the rodent research is the protein. And so there are certain amino acids, specifically methionine is the main one that's focused on, that if we have too much of it and it's not balanced by glycine, then it reduces longevity. And so what they found is that calorie restriction does work to extend longevity, but so does methionine restriction, even if the calories are maintained at the same level. So that is just, and this is not the only factor, but it is one factor that almost entirely accounts for the supposed benefits of calorie restriction, is just the restriction of methionine.
Which is from protein, animal protein.
Yeah, it's right, but mostly the muscle meat, as opposed to the collagen or gelatin piece. And so what they actually find is glycine, which is the main amino acid in the collagen and gelatin. When they supplement glycine and they keep the normal amount of methionine, it actually extends lifespan a considerable amount. So really, what we're looking at here is an imbalance in these types of amino acids, where we've focused so much on the muscle meat, we're not getting enough collagen and gelatin. And that's one of these main factors that affects longevity, and it has nothing to do with whether the calories are restricted or not.
Wow. Yeah. So I didn't know that part. That's very interesting. And there's also flaw in the fact that it was done on mice, because yes, they're very close to humans, which is why we do a lot of these studies on mice, but their lifespan is only like 3 years or something. Is that right? There's some flaw there with that.
Oh, there's a handful. So a lot of the research isn't even done on rodents. A lot of it is done on lower organisms. Like there's one that's very commonly used, which is C. elegans. It's a nematode, really tiny, like worm that's about 1 millimeter in length. And this is some of the original research is looking at these nematodes, and they find that restricting calories in them extends the lifespan. But what they didn't acknowledge and didn't kind of point out is that the way that it does it is that these nematodes will go into a hibernation state. It's called dower. It's called a dower phase. And what they do is they basically turn down all of their processes and go into hibernation. And that is what leads to the lifespan extension. It's not actually an improvement in health or anything like that. And obviously we can't do that same thing and survive. So that's where, so that's a lot of the research that's being pointed to is done in these C. elegans. And that's a huge confounding variable there.
Yeah.
There's another major one when it comes to the rodents, though, too, is a lot of times what they do is they'll have one group that's calorie restricted, and the other group is fed what's called ad libitum, which means that they can eat as much as they want. And so what happens is the ad libitum group becomes very overweight. Of course, they're eating like terrible, chow food. They become very overweight and they have disease processes that go on and they die earlier. And then the calorie restriction group is relative to the ad libitum group, they have longevity improvements, right? They live longer. But the reason for that has nothing to do with the calorie restriction being beneficial, but rather just the ad libitum being harmful. So the ones who are overeating, that's harmful, but they don't actually have a good control group there in the vast majority of the research.
Right. Yes.
So,
Yes. Yeah. That's the article I was reading about they had like 24 different types of diets, and they were looking at, what caused them to live longer. And it was the low protein macros in those groups that seem to live the longest. But then that just doesn't make sense, because when we're having a higher carb intake and where our BMI goes up, there's no longevity proof there that, in humans, that we live longer when we have a higher BMI. It's just the opposite. So it was kind of, I've been reading so much about this, like it's all muddled in my brain, but yeah, very interesting. So when it comes to fasting then, Jay, like, people like the Dr. Jason Fung and all of these, big timers that are saying, fast, 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 because we want that autophagy. So where is that healthy balance where we can get this, do you still believe that that is a healthy stressor, but just are we overdoing it?
So the problem that's come about when it comes to hormesis is that we've built on this foundation of largely faulty research. And we look at these pathways that go on when we're doing the calorie restriction, and we say, here are these pathways that get activated, and they led to the longevity, so these must be the beneficial pathways. And they include activating autophagy. They include activating mitochondrial biogenesis. They include all these little, there's increases in ROS that lead to the activity of AMP kinase and NRF2 and on. All these, it's not so important for us to go through all the intermediate steps here. But the point is that we've taken this original research that we assumed to be accurate, that calorie restriction or other means of improving longevity actually work by doing that. And they do it by increasing stress through these pathways. So these pathways must be beneficial. And then we take that and we say, what else increases these pathways? And we have something like exercise, or we have something like fasting that increase those same pathways and drive those same processes. And so we assume that because they do that, they must be beneficial. They must be healthy because they're creating the stress. But the problem is that the stress was never accounting for the benefits. There's changes in the protein intake. There's the issues with ad libitum feeding. There's the issues with, the study designs. And there's kind of more issues with this research. And so it was never the stress that was actually accounting for the benefits. And so, but we've assumed that it was. Mm-hmm. And so now we take this assumption that the stressful pathways are beneficial, and we look at something like fasting and we know it increases those pathways. So we assume that it must be beneficial. Now, what I will say is, of course, I'm not saying that anything that does activate these pathways is bad, right? Exercise is great. Some other things that might, like if we're in the sun for a long time, right? And that's going to increase our demands and that could cause some stress. It still doesn't mean that sunlight is bad. But what it does mean in these cases is that the stress is not the beneficial factor. There's other things that are beneficial. And I would look at the stress as kind of a byproduct of the let's say, exercise, where the stress itself is not why we benefit from exercise, but there are other factors that allow us to benefit from exercise. And fasting is very much the same. So can fasting be beneficial? Absolutely. And there's a couple of reasons for that. But at the same time, we also know that it is stressful. And so we have to look at that balance and kind of weigh whether the benefits are worth the stress. And in most cases where someone's benefiting from fasting, sure, the benefits are outweighing the stress, at least for that period of time. But as you're saying, and as we talked about, it tends to catch up with us or with that person. And so I would prefer to get the benefits from fasting without causing the stress. Mm-hmm. And there are ways that we can do that. And so when it comes to fasting, I would say the two main benefits. One is that it leads to a lot of benefits with our gut. Our gut health is kind of one of the center points of our physiology. And there's a ton of things that can go wrong there and drive, I'm sure that, listeners are familiar with leaky gut and intestinal permeability and all of the various inflammatory states that can go on with the gut. There are a lot of toxins that are also produced by the microbes in the gut. like endotoxin, which is produced by certain bacteria. These drive systemic inflammatory states. They're associated with all sorts of chronic health diseases. And when we fast, we relieve our gut from anything that was going wrong, any sort of harm that was going on. If we were eating foods that it wasn't agreeing with, or if there's certain overgrowths, the fasting leads to relief from those things. And so that's the first reason for a lot of the benefits, and it's a huge one. But as we'll kind of get to, we can get those benefits without the fasting. And then the other main benefit I would say is that it is helpful in that if we're struggling with our glucose metabolism, if we're not metabolizing carbohydrates very well, and we're still eating them, like someone who is diabetic and still eating carbohydrates, and we're not fixing the issue in the first place, that's going to create a problematic state, a state where we're not having much energy because we're not using any fuel efficiently. We're trying to force the carbohydrates, but it's not working too well. And in that state, it's typically better to at least burn fat than nothing. So we have this relief from this poor glucose metabolism because when we're fasting, we rely on fat metabolism. So that's kind of the two main benefits there. And as I was kind of getting at with the latter, if we fix the glucose metabolism in the first place, then we don't have to worry about avoiding it. But maybe we could talk about those things in more detail. But anyway, that's kind of my view on fasting, is that it can work through these benefits, but it also causes stress that does have a major negative effect. And so if we can achieve the same benefits without the fasting, I'd much prefer to go that route.
Right. Now, one of the benefits I see in fasting in my world is that it is really great for weight loss when it comes to, like, rather than, if you look at like a week's view of calorie intake, rather than calorie restricting somebody, so they're eating, breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks, but we're going to keep that down to 1,200 calories in that full day of eating. That's a lot harder to do than if you told somebody, intermittent fast 3 days a week till 12 o'clock or 2 o'clock. And then you'll have that same calorie reduction by the end of the week without as much suffering, right? Because fasting, when you just extend that window of not eating, it's so much easier to do that than to just cut down on the amount that you're eating throughout the entire day. So I find that it's like you have to be very careful because you don't want to overdo that fasting, because then you're causing too much stress in the long term. But did you hear what I'm saying? Like, would you agree with that?
Yeah, it does make it easier to restrict calories, definitely. Whether that's not normally the way that I like to look at fat loss, I try not to go that route. I think that we can achieve fat loss through other means that have nothing to do with reducing calories. For example, the gut mechanisms I was mentioning. So I mentioned endotoxin, and mild endotoxemia is something that's very tightly associated with obesity and diabetes and metabolic syndrome. And if we relieve that state, if we're just able to reduce something like endotoxin, that alone could be something that leads to massive benefits in terms of weight. But I do have some concerns instead when it comes to something like fasting for weight loss. Is, when it comes to some of the new research that is looking at what's going on in humans, some of them, there's a recent study, I don't remember the name of the researcher, but he was a major advocate for fasting. And I'm pretty sure he's an MD and was recommending it to all of his patients and ran this study. And what he found was that he had one group that was fasting and I believe on a slight deficit, and another group that was just on the slight deficit. And the fasting group, I want to say, lost the same amount of weight, but lost more fat-free mass and less body fat. And as soon as he saw that happened, he stopped recommending that his patients fast, because what was happening was they were just losing more muscle mass as opposed to actually losing as much body fat. And I think that is a consequence that we're privy to when we do fast, because when we're not eating anything, we have to be producing energy from somewhere, and we have to produce fuel from somewhere. And if we don't have enough stored, one of the places that we will start to break down is our muscle mass. We'll start to break that down through gluconeogenesis, start producing carbohydrate from our own muscle. And so that is a concern of mine as well when it comes to fasting.
And when that happens, is there an increase in stress response when we start to break down muscle over fat?
Well, so typically both of those will happen at the same time, because if we're coming from, let's say, a quote normal carbohydrate rich diet, if we're not already on a low carb diet and we're using some amount of carbs for fuel and some amount of fats for fuel, as soon as we stop eating, if we go into a fast, we'll shift into more of the fat burning. We will shift toward the fat burning more, but we'll still need to be using some amount of glucose, whether it's in our brains or our kidneys or wherever else, our muscles. And so that is going to have to come from either stored glycogen if we have enough, or if that starts to get depleted, then we'll start to dip into the protein stores. So I guess I would say it's the kind of last step there, as you're suggesting. It is a deeper state of stress when first we would just use the stored glycogen, let's say in our liver, and then we would go to more of the protein. And that does require more cortisol as opposed to the glucagon, for example. But yeah, that is something that we would tend to dip into when we're basically starving ourselves of food, but especially carbohydrates.
Yeah. And does it tend to happen when we're in longer states of fasting rather than just like a 16 and 8 window that you start to, jeopardize the muscle mass?
So the study that I was referencing was
Mm-hmm.
intermittent fasting. It wasn't long-term fasting. Um,
Wow.
but it would probably depend in large part on the individual. If I guess I would say if someone's trying to go the fasting route, it might be even better to be in a lower carb state because you're already relying more on fat as opposed to trying to rely on carbs and then avoiding the carbs and having to try to make up for that with what would eventually be protein. But I tend to prefer not to go that route anyway, as it is.
Right. Yeah. And what you're saying too is like, if you don't have to go to that extent, why would you? Like you can get these benefits by not having to be so hardcore and fasting for days on end. And with the idea of the influence on your gut microbiome being kind of the target of what we should be looking at as far as weight loss goes. Is that right?
I would say that's one of the main, yeah, definitely one of the
Mm-hmm.
main factors. Of course, if we're dealing with nutrient deficiencies or various other issues, those will have an effect as well. But the gut health being a main one.
Yeah. And you talk about the cost of low carb diets and fasting and why they aren't effective for long-term weight loss when we see with some people that it is very effective. But what have you found?
Yeah, it's always, it's always tough because on one hand we have the timeline, right? How far ahead are we looking? What is long term? Are we talking a year, 2 years, 3 years? At what point do things come crashing down, or do they not? It's hard to say. The people who have
It
maybe been
is.
doing it well for longer, have they just not hit the crash yet, or are they built differently? I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no,
I
I know. I find this too in my own practice. It's like everybody's at so different, right? As far as when does this start to happen?
Yeah, yeah. But I do think the physiology that underpins it it leads nowhere other than stress. And I think that stress leads nowhere other than a lot of the things you're mentioning, right? The reduced thyroid hormone conversion and seeing the low T3, the increased reverse T3, the elevated cholesterol going along with that. Normally seeing the increased insulin resistance over time as well. I think that those are the natural byproducts of these pathways. When we're not eating or if we're going on low carb, we have to rely on the stress hormones, the glucagon, the adrenaline, the cortisol, and their direct effects involve reducing thyroid hormone conversion, reducing thyroid hormone production, reducing the production of the reproductive hormones, basically doing everything they can to turn our metabolism down so that we can conserve as much energy as possible, as opposed to using it to actually function. That's the natural effect of whether it's fasting or low carb. And it's entirely evolutionarily consistent in that way, right? If we were in a famine, if we were starving, if we didn't have food available, our bodies would naturally turn down the dial so that we could survive for longer. If we keep our metabolism as high as it could be during those times, we're going to run out of fuel real quick and we won't survive. And so these are all of the kind of natural, we can look at it through the physiological mechanisms, but they're just a reflection of what our bodies are trying to do to adapt and survive.
Mm-hmm. And we hear from all these experts why these stressors are supposedly good for us. Why is it then that it's bad for us? Like what's happening that makes it bad? That's when you talk
Yes.
about stress, right? It's just kind of a vague kind of umbrella term. Like what's actually happening in the body besides this turn down of the dial? Why is this stress not good?
Yeah. So that's a great point. It's probably helpful to define what I even mean when I'm saying stress. And so normally what I'm referring to here is a depletion of energy. And so that's something that's going to happen whether we're going for a run, or we just don't eat for a long time, or we are working really hard mentally, or psychologically we're very taxed. Maybe it's like a fight or something like that. Or if we're in any other, if we're dealing with a huge excess of heavy metals or whatever it is that could be creating a stress, like creating an energy deficit, that is what drives stress. And so stress is our normal response to that energy deficit. And it's not inherently bad, right? We need to have it there. If we don't, we're in way
We'd
more
be
trouble.
dead. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So when we're running and we can't constantly be refueling as we're doing that, like if we go for a long run or any sort of exercise, we need to be, we have an immediate energy deficit, and we need to mobilize our fuel stores, and so that we have enough fuel to then produce some more energy and respond to whatever we're doing, so we can keep living, moving, whatever it is that we're trying to do. And as you're saying, if we don't do that, we would die pretty quickly. It wouldn't go too well for us. So this stress response is entirely normal. It's there for a really great reason, and we want to have it there. But it does come at a cost. And a way that I would maybe like to think of it is, it's like we're taking out a bit of a loan. We're going into debt, taking out a loan. And that's fine. We can pay that loan back, right? We can, if we're pulling from our stores and telling our body that we're dipping into, let's say, our savings, or something like that. We can, after we're done with our exercise session, we can recover, we can rest, we can eat and refill everything, and we're fine. But when we're relying on these pathways excessively, the more that we do it, the more that we turn down that dial. And it's again, a very adaptive, beneficial mechanism, right? If we're seeing our bank account continuing to go down and down and down, we better spend less, otherwise we're going to be bankrupt pretty quick. And that's what our bodies are doing. They're just seeing that the more that we dip into the stress, the more that they want to reduce their energy expenditure, the expenditure that goes to our brain, to all of our bodily functions, reproductive function we've been talking about, and that is the means through which we're turning our metabolism down. And as we were saying, this is what allows us to survive and function, but it comes at a cost to how we function, and it also, in the long term, and it also ends up driving increases in body fat. So we talked about how, and we have the short-term benefit from these sorts of interventions, but long-term, the weight tends to come back and more. And this happens whether we're just on a typical low-calorie diet and exercising a ton, or we're doing the low-carb approach, where, again, the weight typically starts to come off, and then typically it'll come back, and we'll be dealing with other health issues at the same time. And again, this is our body's completely normal response. When it's low on fuel, it's low on stores, and it's turning its metabolism down, as much as it can, it's going to want to direct any fuel coming in toward fat stores. It's going to want to replenish those stores. And that's because it's sensing this stress state, sensing this kind of starvation, famine type state, and trying to survive. And so that's why, for these exact reasons, it's why I tend not to prefer going that route, whether we're trying to lose weight or we're trying to just improve our health, when there's so many other things that we can do to actually increase the energy available, so that we can increase our metabolisms, increase the amount of fuel we're using, the amount of energy we have available for everything to function, and then reduce the storage of fuel as fat, because our bodies are sensing that they don't need to be storing fat. They're not in a starvation state. They're not in a very high stress state where they want to be conserving as much as possible.
Yeah. And I think when we're thinking about the timeline for each individual for when this begins to happen, I bet it has so much to do with, well, how stressed out were you before you started doing this? Like, where, if we're looking at it kind of from that, we've got this cut where your bank account's full. And if you were really rich going into it, it may take a lot longer before you start to see those negative effects, because you've got lots of money in the bank, lots of energy in the bank. But if you came into it already depleted and you start withdrawing, it's going to happen a heck of a lot faster when your body starts to set up that, that stress response and be like, no, this isn't working. This is not good. Mine happened it happened to me very quickly. Like, I couldn't get into the ketogenic diet for very long because my thyroid instantly, because it was already a problem, instantly reduced farther. And I had to be very careful with how I was doing it. So I do think that, even just toxic load, if you've got a lot of toxic load, which is a stressor in and of itself, and then plus you've got the life stress, which we all have now, and then you go in hardcore, let's fast 4 days out of 7 and eat a super low carb, no carb diet, it's going to happen a lot faster.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And that's one of, I think, the biggest, I don't know, I guess another issue I have when it comes to hormesis is that our bodies are already under so much stress. As you were saying, the amount that we work, the amount that we sleep, or I should say don't sleep, the quality of our food supply, the amount of pollutants we're exposed to, and on and on and on. And then to assume that that's not enough stress and we need to add more in order to get into that really narrow zone where we get all the benefits. Like there's this really narrow zone, we've got all this stress going on, and then we need to add more on. That's how we get to that zone. I think is, yeah, completely there's at least a conflict there in terms
Yeah.
of what's actually going on physiologically. And I don't think that that's the best approach for that reason. Yeah.
No, no. Now, where the problem lies, Jay, is I've had people come on here, people like Kate Deering. I'm sure you're familiar with her, and Josh and Jeannie Rubin, and I loved them. They had some of the most, downloaded interviews out of all my podcasts. And I had a lot of people that listened to Kate, for instance, in my interview with her, and her thing is very much aligned with yours. She's all about, raising metabolism and eating more to do that and all of these great things. But I've started to hear back from all of these people that had gone to her, and this is no diss to Kate, because I'm sure she's gets wonderful results with people, just saying that this can be a problem, which is a lot of people went from this super low carb dieting, fasting world, thought, oh, well, this sounds really appealing. I get to eat all the time and I get to eat carbohydrates and I'm going to raise my metabolism and lose weight effortlessly. And they all ended up gaining weight. Not all of them, but the ones that came back to me to say, oh, I tried that and I gained like 20 pounds. And it's like, okay, we have to find this balance. And that's really challenging to do, where we can preserve our hormones, where we can not stress out our systems in the long term and have sustainable weight loss, which weight loss in and of itself is stressful and your body will fight against that. So what have you developed, created, or come up with when it comes to this conundrum of, we can't send people way over to this other side and tell them start drinking orange juice and milk and eating every 2 hours to raise your metabolism and eat carbohydrates. And even that, I think his name was Matt Cook, you know him?
Matt Stone, maybe.
Matt Stone, thank you. Matt Stone, so many people. I remember reading all his forum years ago and reading all of these reviews and saying, I got fat, I gained weight, but I felt so much better. Which I thought was interesting. But these people were all gaining weight because they were eating ice cream and pizza and all this crap food, and they kind of took it the wrong way. And so how does somebody lose weight then with not harming their system and not going too far on one side than the other?
Yeah. Yeah. And
$1 million
it's
question, Jay.
right. And most of the people coming to me are people coming from low carb, carnivore, fat, from this place. And when someone's lost a lot of weight that way and are looking to kind of reverse back the other direction, it is very easy for weight to come on.
Yeah.
And so normally, we have to be careful and do, make sure we're doing certain things properly, be careful not to do other things. But also I will say, kind of like we were talking about, where we've taken out these loans, we're going to have to pay it back at some point. If somebody is on, if we think of the kind of typical yo-yo dieting, low calorie, excess exercise approach, and someone's on a downswing, right? They're down 20, 30 pounds. And we know that if we look long enough in that timeline, they're going to end up not only back up the 20, 30 pounds that they lost, but probably more above that. If they immediately start to bump their calories up and maybe do it from really great foods and do everything right, they still might gain a little bit of weight. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Now, I'm not saying long term we should be continuing to gain weight. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be able to lose the weight. I'm not saying that it's ideal to gain 20, 30, 40, 50 pounds, but a little bit of gaining some back, I think, is part of paying back the debt. And I think that there's a small amount there that is probably going to happen for most people. But I will say, if we're doing things properly, the weight will come back down. So that's kind of first thing to I think that's important for the mindset, is that if we've driven this stress for so long and we've been putting ourselves into this debt and come at the compromise, we've compromised our health in so many ways, that one of the things that is going to happen when we're trying to recover in order to get out of that stress state is there might be a small amount of weight coming back. And so I understand that a lot of people don't want that, and that's okay. Then, I think it's a
It's
tough,
tough. It's tough.
yes, it's
Yeah,
really tough.
it's
It's
tough.
really tough. And again, I do want to
Especially if
clarify.
they've like totally ruined their metabolism and become so carb intolerant because they've done no carbs for so long that and they'll say, oh, I can eat, fruit, or I can eat, one wrong thing, and boom, I've gained 7 pounds. And it's like,
Mm.
well, look what you've done to your metabolism. There's going to be this like time period where you have to reverse diet basically to get that metabolism working properly again. And that means you may need to gain some weight.
Yeah, and remember also, I mean, if someone's jumping up 7 pounds, and I know you're just throwing out a number, but I've seen those kinds of things
But
happening,
that's,
three,
yeah,
five
same.
pounds.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's not body fat. If that's happening in a day
Yeah.
or two, that's not body fat. We don't gain body fat that quickly. That's
Yeah.
water weight, that's glycogen. That might be an inflammation, water retention. As you were saying, maybe they're really carb intolerant. But we want to remember that's not body fat. That's a sign that, I mean, A, either you were very depleted before, or B, there's something else going on. And sometimes that's helpful to know and helpful
That's great.
to
Yeah.
to recognize that if we're seeing those big shifts, that's not actual body fat gain. And we still don't want to like see it continuing to jump up. But
Yeah.
yeah, so I think when someone is in that place, right, they're in this really stressed, low metabolism, low thyroid, low carb metabolism, or poor glucose metabolism. We do want to be really careful about what we're doing. And if somebody goes from that to, as you were saying, the ice cream, all the desserts, all the things that we were depriving ourselves of, there will probably be more weight gain. And to some people, that's totally worth it. Like they've restricted for so long and they've been in such, like they've been so hard fighting against their bodies that they want to have some freedom again and they're okay with it. Then that's amazing. I think there can be some real healing that comes both physically and mentally there. And then again, I do totally think that the weight can come down. But if someone else is saying, look, I want to do this really carefully, I want to try to gain as a small amount of weight as possible, I think that there's a route there as well. And it tends, from my view, to look like bringing in sticking to the whole foods. I would almost think of it as kind of like a keto plus fruit approach, where it's not actually keto in terms of macronutrients, but we're keeping those types of foods, the healthy fats, healthy protein sources, maybe some cooked veggies. Someone's doing okay gut-wise with those, and adding in small amounts of whole fruit and kind of building up slowly from there. Because that's going to be the main thing that helps to get out of the stress state is the carbohydrates. We just want to make sure we're doing it in a dose that our bodies are able to handle, right? That somebody's able to handle. And so that's normally the place I would start for somebody like that and see how they're responding. If there's a lot of weight gain going on, that's a sign that something else is off, right? That's a sign that we're very insulin resistant or there's something off with the gut. And I would address something like that before just adding more or just saying that that's normal. So that's kind of the approach I would take is very slowly going into it, sticking more with the whole foods for somebody who is in that place, and slowly increasing the carbs, right? Not going from 20 to 300, which I've seen some people, do. And again, they're just saying, look, like I feel way better when I just bring them in, and I'm okay if I gain a little bit extra weight during that time. And that was what I did, by the way. I was really deprived, and just I knew that this was the way toward better health, and it felt so much better. I can't describe like the feelings of freedom from restriction, both in terms of just general hunger and carbs. And I really dove in, 2 feet or head first, and ate a ton. I probably gained somewhere between 20 and 25 pounds, and then it came off several months later. But that's not the approach that everyone wants to take as well, which is totally fine.
Do you find that, so for yourself, like when you started to eat more carbohydrates, you put on this 20, 25 pounds, did you then do something to take it off after that refeed period? Or did your body just adapt? And because it was in this very restricted state, it rebound weight gain you and then started to come off again naturally? Or did you have to then do something to get the weight off?
So there were a couple of small tweaks I made when I had first started bumping up the carbs, and again going from 50 to 100 a day, 100 on the workout days, of course, to 4, 5, 600 carbs grams of carbs a day.
Wow.
When I initially did that, I was still coming from the low carb camp, I was very concerned about fructose intake and sugar intake overall. And so I was really favoring a lot of starch heavy foods. And I wasn't digesting those as well as I could have. And that led to some amount of the weight gain as well. And so I didn't reduce the amount I was eating at all, but I did start to shift that toward more, quote, sugar based carbs, more fruit based. And I think that was something that allowed for my weight to come down as well. But I think it was also time. There was a point where I was so deprived that so I started adding sugar to my coffee. I remember adding 14 spoons of sugar to like a small 8 to 10 ounce coffee, which now I would not be able to drink. It would be gross. But at the time, I couldn't get enough. I really needed it. And so that was something that shifted as well. Like naturally, my needs and desires started to go down. And I was also able to shift towards some better food sources for me and where my gut health was at, especially. And so that was something that also allowed for the weight to come down.
Do you think it's because we're so hardwired as hunter gatherers still that, when you deprive yourself so long of carbohydrates, that naturally as a hunter gatherer, if that was happening, it would mean that we were in winter. And then you go allow yourself to have a little bit of sugar, which that could be compared to, oh, it's spring, fruit is starting to come around and we're going to get more carbohydrates in our diet as a hunter gatherer. And we were built to, if you came across something like that, to eat as much as you could, because who knows when it's going to come back next, right? So this high calorie, high sugar, even if it was naturally occurring, we would be triggered to eat a lot of it because we hadn't had it for so long. Nowadays, we can't, it's so hard to think like that because it's around us all the time, but your body doesn't know that. Your body doesn't understand. So I think that for you and for other people, when they have that, like, it's the yo-yo dieting effect, right? What happens to your brain and what's going on when you're depriving so long of carbohydrates that it goes, oh my God, you just had sugar, eat as much as you possibly can.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I 100%. I mean, that is our body's normal response, right? We've literally deprived it of energy for a very long time. And so it wants as much as it can to get out of that state. And yeah, that's, I think, a huge feature of the refeeding for sure. And yeah, I think I would say it's our normal response coming from any situation where we were deprived of the food that I would say is most supportive. When we're able to get access to it again, our bodies want it pretty badly.
Is there any place for it? I mean, if you do have really bad gut microbiome and you've been eating a standard American diet, you're insulin resistant or type 2 diabetic, we know the research shows us that fasting and low carb diets work the best to reverse those problems. So how do we find that happy medium? And do you believe that there is a place for those diets?
So normally I'll tailor carb intake to carb tolerance. So if somebody is dealing with type 2 diabetes, then I would not put them on hundreds of grams of, 200-300 grams of carbohydrates. I would titrate that to their tolerance.
Mm-hmm.
But the vast majority of time, again, unless someone is in that far of a state, I don't find low carb to be necessary. Again, for somebody, it might be 150 grams instead of 250 if they're coming from low carb and needing to work their way up slowly based on their needs. But normally I would not go lower than that, or I wouldn't find it necessary to go lower than that for most people.
Mm-hmm.
And again, when it comes to the low carb, the benefits of keto, there's a lot to suggest that these are gut mediated. For example, with keto, they've done a lot of different research where they're doing fecal microbial transplants in rodents and seeing that a lot of the benefits get transferred, if not all of them get transferred from mice that were on keto to ones who are not, just by transferring over the gut microbiome. And so I think, again, if someone's eating a standard American diet or typical carbohydrates, the whole grains and salads and whatnot, the kind of a lot of raw vegetables and things like that, then yeah, it's going to be near impossible to to be in a good place while eating carbohydrates. But I don't think that those things are ideal for us as it is. And so I don't think it's the carbs that are the problem in that case, but rather the types of carbs. And I know you were talking earlier, you mentioned, the person who gains, 7 pounds, from just eating carbs one time. And I think so often when I know I did this when I was low carb is, I would have a cheat day and I would eat something that it wasn't just carbs, right? It wasn't a piece of fruit. It was, let's say it's pizza, right? And we think, oh, that's carbs. That's why I gained some weight from that. But it's not carbs, right? It's a lot of polyunsaturated fats from canola oil or other seed oils. It's, processed white wheat flour that can cause all sorts of issues, especially gut wise, and on from there. And so I think so many of the things that we're blaming on the carbohydrates have more to do with the foods themselves and where we're getting those carbs from, as opposed to actually the carbohydrates themselves.
Yeah, I'm glad you clarified that because I think a lot of people listening are probably like, what? You guys don't know what you're talking about. Like, if I go eat carbs, I gain weight and we become insulin resistant. And so let's clarify what when we're talking carbs in your world and what you're seeing as far as success with weight loss and gut microbiome, what kind of carbs are you putting an emphasis on in the diet?
Yeah, so generally it's fruit first, ideally whole fruit, maybe some dried fruit, maybe some fruit juices, all those kind of depending on what your carb tolerance is and where your gut health is. Certain fruits might be a bit of an issue because if they're more fibrous, can cause some issues if your gut health isn't great. So you might have to favor lower FODMAP fruits or maybe some juices for a bit. Also, honey and maple syrup are good sources as well. And then roots and tubers, so potatoes, sweet potatoes, uh, squashes, which are actually more fruits, any other root vegetables, yucca, something like that. Those would be the kind of next category I would go to. And those would be really the main sources I would focus on, maybe a bit of white rice and some properly processed grains, nixtamalized corn or some soaked and sprouted. You could do like sprouted oatmeal or something, but normally I would really favor the fruit-based carbohydrates and the roots and tubers.
And so, and you see that people lose weight when they do this.
Yes, I have lots of clients who lose weight while eating lots of carbohydrates, lots of
Yes,
carbohydrates.
because so many people have it in their head now that you cannot lose weight if you're not burning ketones.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately.
And that ketones is our primary source of fuel, that should be your primary source of fuel, which I completely disagree with. So tell me your thoughts on that.
Yeah, you brought up this idea that we need to be kind of fat burning in order to lose
Yes.
body fat.
Yeah.
So there's a really great study by Kevin Hall, and it's a metabolic ward study. So they have one group of people who's on a low carb diet and one who's on a low fat diet, low fat, high carb or low carb, high fat. And the low carb, high fat group was burning more fat and higher amounts of fat oxidation. They have much lower amounts of insulin and the other kinds of things that you see, the other normal hormonal shifts that you see when you're on a low carb diet. And yet they lost less body fat compared to the low fat, high carb group that was burning much more carbohydrates. They had much less fat burning, much less fat oxidation, and higher levels of insulin. And there's a good other, there's a lot of research kind of against the whole carb insulin hypothesis. But what essentially has happened is we've focused so much on this idea of fat burning that we've forgotten about the other side of that equation. And so when we're looking at fat stores, we have the fat burning and the fat release, but we also have the fat coming into the fat stores. And the things that drive the fat storage tend to be the elevated stress hormones, which are elevated when we're burning more fat anyway. So the only reason I'm pointing that out is just to kind of get away from this idea that burning fat equals fat loss, right? Because we can also be storing more fat. And that's normally what happens when we're on a lower carb diet is we can be maintaining our weight because yes, we're burning more fat, but we're storing more. We're just using those fat stores more essentially. And we're burning the fat that's coming in as opposed to just the fat from our fat stores as well.
Right. Yeah. And so do low calorie diets work?
Right, right. And so, yeah, so when we're in any sort of like kind of low calorie state or deficit, which can be brought on by low carb as well, we're going to be having more fat being released from the fat stores than fat coming in. And so there will be fat burning going on there, but you can still do that while burning very large amounts of carbohydrates. But in that case, again, we're relying on those stress pathways. So I know we're kind of bouncing around a bit, but to get back to the kind of fat versus carb burning and the keto situation, the presence of ketones, and are ketones the preferred fuel? So in that state, what it really comes down to is a question of fat versus carbs rather than ketones. And the reason for that is because ketones are never going to be the fuel that our bodies entirely are running on. When we're in a ketogenic state, we are producing ketones, but we're only producing a pretty small amount, and it's mostly for the brain, right? The brain can use up to about 60% of ketones as its fuel. It still needs about 40% from glucose. And so in this ketogenic state, where our bodies are mostly burning fat, almost entirely fat, and then we've got some ketones for the brain, and then we've got some glucose for the brain and for some other areas as well. But the real question here is really the carbs versus fats, because the ketones are a much more minor part. And when it comes to the carbs versus fats, the fat burning, the fat oxidation, mirrors all of the other states that drive stress. And the reason for that is because our kind of backup state, if we're starving, if we're in a famine, if we're exercising for a really long time, any stress state, which we could also call a backup state, relies on fat burning. And so fat burning acts as a signal of stress.
Yes.
And when we're talking about that stress, as we talked about earlier, that is the same signals that are going to turn down our thyroid, turn down reproductive hormones, all of that. And so there are some biochemical reasons, if we could dig into the biochemistry and talk about the difference in fat versus carb burning, and the fact that fat produces a higher FADH2 to NADH ratio, and that causes a lower NAD to NADH ratio, and you get increased reactive oxygen species production of the electron transport chain as a result of that. And these just lead to all those same signals that we talked about earlier, the hormesis signals, the stress signals, and fat burning is just a major part of that. And so that's my biggest concern when it comes to fat versus carb burning, is that it's driving that stress that we really don't want to rely on. And so when we have the carbs available for at least part of our bodies to run on, we're able to avoid that stress. And in order to be producing ketones, as I was saying, we have to be in the state that's largely fat dependent, which is my biggest concern there. The ketones themselves, I think, are fine. Like, for example, if you were on a more moderate carbohydrate diet where you're not in as much of a stress state, and you just added exogenous ketones, I think that's fine. I don't think there's really any major concern with that. I still think there are still some benefits, I would say, to glucose over ketones, but it's much smaller. It's pretty similar between the two. But again, the state that we have to be in order to produce ketones is a very highly stressed state, and has to rely on the glucagon and or adrenaline and cortisol in order to be in that state. And so that's my biggest concern there, is not even the ketones themselves, but rather the fat burning and the lack of carb burning and the stress state that we have to be in to produce the ketones.
Mm-hmm. I think the issue that I see in my practice and with myself even is the idea, the research might show that in that one anyways, that eating low fat, higher carbs created more weight loss. But which one was easier? Because I found that I always ate a very whole food, healthy diet without processed foods, but it had grains in it, and it had a lot of good whole food carbohydrates. But my blood sugar was a freaking mess. I would constantly eat because I was so hungry all the time, that when I finally shifted to a paleo-based diet, over the keto, especially too, like the paleo seemed to work best for me because it was still lower in carbohydrates. I focused more on protein, less on fat, and less on the carbs. And that seemed to be kind of like my perfect way to eat. And I find that with a lot of people, that they just seem to find that if they don't put an emphasis on carbs and they lower that carb intake, that their hunger signals are a lot healthier, and that they naturally can go into a caloric deficit without really trying. When a moderate carb or higher carb, low fat diet, low calorie diet, you just that the hunger signals are so overpowering that it makes it so hard to stick to. So how do you manage all of that?
Yeah, and that is someone, just to kind of give voice to the other side. And I mentioned that Kevin Hall study earlier. A lot of the low carb advocates said, well, you controlled, both groups had the same amount of calories, but naturally on low carb, you'd probably eat less. And that's where the benefit comes from. And fine. I mean, if that's, there might be some validity there, but the reason why I don't prefer that still is because my goal is not to reduce calorie intake, but rather to improve the conversion of the food that's coming in into energy. So we could be eating potentially the same amount of calories, but less of it being stored toward body fat and more of it being converted toward energy. And so there are, you mentioned a few different things and some, a couple of responses that come to mind. One is I'm not a big fan of low fat. I do think very low fat or too low fat will cause a lot of hunger. And I think we need to have a good amount of fat intake to fuel our muscles, especially if we're lean and active, then we definitely need more fat. So I normally don't recommend someone goes below 20%. Sometimes as high as 30 to 40% is ideal from my view. And I don't, if someone's going too low, it does tend to cause excess hunger, which I do think is not ideal. And then, of course, you mentioned the grains. And I think that's the other question is, where are those carbohydrates coming from? And what are the other potential problems that are going on as a result there? And so if we have a bacterial overgrowth and then we're eating a lot of very fibrous carbohydrates, a lot of grains that have all sorts of anti-nutrients, that, of course, is not going to be a great match and will lead to issues with actually the production of energy from the food. And so then that's going to be something that drives that food toward fat storage while at the same time increasing hunger. Our hunger signals are driven by the energy availability. So if we are, and this is something that I think is often ignored, but there's some really great research looking at people who are who are overweight or obese. And there's this assumption that they have excess energy. But what's actually happening in those states is they're not effectively converting the food that they're taking in to energy. So their hunger signals remain high because they don't have the energy that turns them off. Those ATP levels are actually what turns off the hunger signals. So they have low ATP, so they're feeling lethargic, they're feeling fatigued. Everything is not working well because there's not the energy to function. And they're still hungry despite eating maybe a decent amount of food because they're not actually converting that fuel efficiently. And so if they continued eating more and more, there's going to be so much that gets directed toward the fat stores. And so if someone's in that state, this is why my focus is so much on improving that conversion from the fuel to energy. And again, that involves improving our gut health, resolving nutrient deficiencies, making sure that we're eating the right types of fats, right? If we're eating a ton of PUFA, I was in the paleo camp for a while, but one of the things I was doing was eating a ton of nuts and seeds. Mm-hmm. And I don't know why those are considered paleo because of the, between the anti-nutrient and the huge amounts of polyunsaturated fats, particularly omega-6s. I don't know why those fall into the paleo realm, but at least at the time they were considered paleo. And so I was eating tons of those. And I think that was a huge, huge issue for me, as well as, the kind of raw vegetables, the raw leafy greens, as well as, and prior to that, I was also doing the grains like you mentioned. And so I think that those pose a ton of problems, right? The unsaturated fats directly cause issues with producing energy, as well as the gut mediated issues due to anti-nutrients, due to microbial overgrowth, any sort of lack of nutrients. So those are kind of the areas I would focus on. And if we're converting that fuel to energy well, we're taking in some amount of, moderate amount of fat, which I think we need. We're also getting a moderate amount of carbohydrates to keep the stress low. Then what I see is that we create a state where we're very efficiently producing energy from the food that we're taking in. Very little is being stored as fat, and we're losing weight in the process because of that.
Yeah, that sounds lovely. If we can only all get there now. But really, so what you're saying is like, let's make all the processes in our system work optimally, like taking the toxins out, fixing the gut, taking in the right enough nutrients into the system so that we can have energy and then be using the food that we're eating as energy rather than storing it as fat. And so it's not about the macros per se or the calorie intake or out model. It's more about how are you utilizing those calories. Is that right?
Absolutely. And of course, the macros are going to affect that. And our time, our eating window is going to affect that. Our exercise is going to affect that. So we still want to be looking at all aspects of our lifestyle, but through this lens that allows us to focus on what's going to improve that conversion to energy.
Yeah. And I think a big piece of that we haven't talked about is protein, because I think that, I don't know if you read the book, Eat Like the Animals.
No, I haven't.
Oh, you have to. They're great. I had them on my podcast, the two guys that wrote the book, but they basically prove through all of their research that humans will overeat carbs and fat to try to reach a certain protein amount in the diet. And so if you prioritize that protein, and they weren't saying too much, it was actually quite low. It was something like if you went from, most people are at about 13% protein. So even if you bumped it up to like 15 to 17, that would naturally create less desire to eat. So you would have a natural caloric deficit because you weren't going to overeat the carbs and fat to try and reach that threshold. And they proved it through so many different studies, human studies, animal studies. It's an incredible book. It's a great read as well. They're really lovely gentlemen. You can listen to them. I'll send you the podcast I did about them. But I really think that that's a big part of it too, to reach what the state that you're talking about, where it just kind of comes naturally as to how much of all of these macros that we should be eating. Is you want to make sure that you have enough protein, because when you do that, then you tend to naturally eat just the right amounts of carbs and fat, for if you really get in tune with your system and clean it all up, and you can be that intuitive.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think getting that amount of protein, normally the range I'll suggest is zero 0.6 to zero 0.8 grams per pound. And that seems to be the point where that seems to be the point where we're getting maximum maximal benefits when we look at muscle growth. Like there's no further benefit beyond that point. So, using that as kind of a top range, like the 0.8 grams per pound, which is even a little safe. But yeah, I think that getting enough protein like that is incredibly important. Of course, we want to make sure it's coming from really nutrient dense sources, and for focusing on whole foods and animal based protein sources, that's where we can get a ton of our nutrients. So yeah, I'm a big fan of that. I'm also, while we're on the topic of protein, I think there's also issues with driving, with excessive amounts, especially a lot of people coming from carnivore. What they're essentially trying to do is eat huge amounts of protein to make up for the lack of carbohydrates that are coming in, and they're converting a lot of that protein to carbs through gluconeogenesis, which I think comes at a major cost. So I wouldn't say it's a situation, and I know you're not saying this, but I would not say that it's a situation where the more protein the better, but definitely that we want to be getting enough for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Somebody said recently, and it was great. Actually, it was a workshop that I did on protein, and they were saying you should aim for about, if you're working out and you're lifting weights, aim for a gram of protein per ideal body weight. And I thought that was brilliant, because you hear so much of this, like 0.8 to 1 gram per pound of body weight. And I'm always like, I can't eat that much protein, And so I think, well, no, it would make more sense, even if it's not ideal body weight, but you just want to shift it down that little bit, because for somebody that's 150 pounds or 160, 170, that's way too much protein to be eating, as a woman, especially if you're not working out. So then that becomes very flawed. So you have to go, okay, ideally what would, maybe 0.5 to 0.8 is more reasonable when it comes to protein. But yeah, some people are saying, I heard a woman recently, it was like 50 grams. You want to get 50 grams of protein per meal. Holy, I was like, no, I have like an off switch, and I could never eat that much protein. It's like, good on you if it's working, but sorry, that doesn't work for me.
Yeah, yeah, and that's also, of course, as you're saying, part of the problem with doing anything is like a per pound ratio. Is if someone's overweight, then we're going
That
to be
doesn't
getting
work.
artificially high numbers. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that doesn't work then. Okay, well, we could keep going here, but I'm going to respect your time. And I feel like we just started talking and it's already been an hour. So I really appreciate it. And you guys, you can find so much more about all this stuff that we're talking about here today, because I feel like we've only scratched the surface. So if you want to take a deeper dive, really head over to Jay Feldman, what was it? .com?
Wellness.
Wellness.com. And then also your podcast, which was
The Energy Balance Podcast.
Thank you. And I'll link to those in the show notes. And you've done a lot of, you do mostly just solo podcasts. So you've got a lot of content on your podcast about all of this. Hey.
Yeah, it's me and my friend Mike, who's the co-host. So we do it together. It's just the two of us. But yeah, so we've got over 80 episodes at this point.
Oh,
so
awesome.
you can check.
And you have a free 7-day mini course on fat loss and energy balance. So you guys, I will also link to that in the show notes, so you can go check that out and see all about it. I think it's really good. Like I'm gonna just emphasize what we're talking about here today. We're not saying go out and get yourself pizza and a bowl of ice cream because this is going to raise your metabolism and make you a healthier person. And that is not what we've said here at all. What we've talked about here today is finding that balance that's going to work for you, not being extreme. Because when you're extreme, you're causing stress to your body, no matter how healthy that extremeness is, whether it's fasting, cold plunging, low carb diets, carnivore. These are considered healthy stressors out there right now. And too much of these things is going to be an overload to your system when it comes to stress and what that's going to do to the hormonal system, which we barely even got into. So we may have to have Jay back again. Maybe we could do like a Q&A next time with the listeners' questions for you. I think that would be really great. I think people will have a lot of questions after hearing today's episode. So thanks, Jay, so much for coming on the show. And I look forward to having you back again.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, I'd be happy to come back and do that. Definitely let me know. And as you were saying, also, just for anyone who was listening today and they we were digging into the mechanisms a lot, but maybe wanted some more of the kind of practical, what exactly do I do here if I'm not eating pizza? That free 7-day mini course that you mentioned is on weight loss. They can find that at jayfeldmanwellness.com/weight loss. And yeah, that would be a great place to go and kind of get that information.
Awesome. All right. Thanks so much.